All right. Thank you for joining me on this episode of The Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Marlon Wilson, and we have another great one for you today. This is more of a quick starter. You know what I mean? I reached out to Deity Defeater, also known as Matt. I reached out to him maybe a couple days ago. We've been planning this, so we finally was able to schedule a time to jump on here. But I thank you for joining me today. This is an early one for me. As you know, I usually come on late night, man. Late in the evening, should I say, about 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and decided to jump on here early. And I'm excited for this one. Like I said, I have Matt with me, and we're gonna be discussing some, morality, God of the Bible type things. He's an atheist, and we're good to kind of have a conversation. And as you know, the Gospel Truth is engaging the culture with Christian truth, and we do that through debates, interviews, and Bible lessons. And as always, I want to go ahead and encourage you to like and follow the Gospel Truth. Make sure you hit that like, make sure you hit that subscribe, make sure you hit that notification bell so you can stay in the loop with the Gospel Truth has going on. Make sure you don't miss out on any shows. Please do that. Please do that. All this Gospel Truth content is not only on YouTube and Facebook, but also on Instagram and Twitter. So make sure you're following there, subscribing there, so that you can make sure you stay in the loop with the Gospel Truth that's going on over there as well. And also all this content is on podcast, so make sure that you are subscribing there. And if you're on a podcast, please leave a good rating so this podcast can get popular and be able to reach the masses, right? I think earlier this week I showed a graph of all the countries that the Gospel Truth podcast has reached, and it is your support that's allowing that to happen, right? The more you share, the more you subscribe, the more you leave good ratings, that makes the podcast popular, man. Comes down the scroll down list first, so make sure you're subscribing to the Gospel Truth. That said, I usually have my announcements here, but I do not want to waste any more time as time is limited. I do want to bring Matt in so he can introduce himself. How you doing, Matt? How you doing, buddy?
Hey, I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Gospel Truth, man. And we're going to jump into this, man. So first, I would like to give you an opportunity to go ahead and introduce yourself. Give a quick introduction. Tell them some things you like. If you got a YouTube page, which I believe you do, go ahead and tell them to follow there. Blogs, whatever you do. Go ahead and give a quick introduction yourself.
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel called Deity Defeater. As you may have been able to deduce from the name, I am an atheist. I enjoy discussing the existence of God and going over arguments for and against the existence of God. You should check it out. I think it's pretty cool. And so today we're going to be discussing moral arguments for God in particular and just God generally. In terms of my the biggest reason why I'm not convinced there's a God, it's the problem of evil. I'm not sure why, if there were a God, there would be so many things in the world that just seem to be bad designs. For example, the existence of malaria, and the existence of other preventable diseases, which kill thousands of children under the age of 5 every day. It seems like if you were a perfect being designing a perfect universe, that's one of the things that you would make sure not to include. And so I think that the fact that so many of these things are in the world proves that the world was not perfectly designed and was the result of random natural processes.
So you say your biggest issue is the problem of evil. All right, can you flesh that out a little bit more? You said, okay, the problem of evil, you said malaria and a couple other things. Flesh that out just a little bit more for me real quick.
Yeah, so the problem of evil is essentially that if there were a God, you would expect the world to just generally be designed pretty well, to not have obvious bad designs that result in large amounts of unnecessary suffering that are not caused by free will. So malaria is not the byproduct of free will, it's the byproduct of an element of the natural world. And yet if there were a perfect being that made the world, you would expect that not to be an element of the natural world. You would expect it not to be the case that thousands of children under the age of 5 die every day. And so I don't see what reason there would be for a God making those. And I think that many of the answers to the problem of evil ultimately fall short.
All right. So what is your definition of God? Are you saying just theism in general, or do you think that you're explaining the God of the Bible or the definition of God of the Bible?
Well, I think that this provides an argument against the existence of an omnipotent omnibenevolent and omniscient God. I don't think that if you say that God does not have those three characteristics, then I don't think that this argument really applies to that version of God. But if you say that there is a God with those three characteristics, which I think most Christians say describe the God of the Bible, then this argument would apply.
All right, fair enough. So the way that the Christian would define God is that he's the ultimate and fundamental, the source of all possibilities and temporal facts, and are derived from God. All right, so you started off displaying a moral displeasure of the God of the Bible. Do you believe that you have to justify your displeasure, or do you think that you can have arbitrary positions as it concerns morality? What do you think?
Well, I think that if we have arbitrary, unjustified positions concerning morality, then those would obviously not be justified reasons to think things about morality. However, I think that we can say that even if one were to accept moral skepticism, which I don't, I think that morality is an objective part of the world. I think that we can still say that if there is a God, that's okay, that if God exists, and that God results in thousands of deaths per day purely because they just chose to bring disease into the world, that God does not correspond with what they would think of as good. That God is only good in the sense of you just refer to that God as good. But if we think of goodness as having certain entailments, such as not killing thousands of babies, which I would think generally would be an entailment of goodness, then I think that we could say that if the God of the Bible brought forth things that kill thousands of babies, then that they acted wrongly.
All right, so why is killing babies wrong? What makes it wrong to kill babies?
Well, I think that babies have the capacity for well-being and suffering. And so I think as a result of that, we have reason to care about achieving their well-being and avoiding their suffering. And the question of how I account for all of morality is sort of a very difficult question that we can go into, I guess. But if we can just agree from the outset that killing babies for no reason is bad, then I think that we can say that if that's true, which I think most of us would accept, then God does not exist, given that I think I can rule out reasons that people would suppose for saying that God would have reasons for bringing malaria into existence. It would say that if that claim is true, which most of us accept, then God does not exist.
All right, but I guess what I'm asking is, okay, so it's important to justify your moral grounding, right? All right, you said that you hold to an objective morals, right? So where is that grounded in? What standard are you using to ground your objective morals?
Well, the question of what standard grounds the objective morals. So there are a few things that question could mean. If that question means, what do those objective morals entail? So like, what procedures do we go through determining if something is right or wrong? I think that we would go through a utilitarian calculus. So we look at if something causes more well-being than suffering, it's good. If it causes more suffering than well-being, then it's bad. Now, if you ask where we get those values in the first place, I think that there doesn't have to be something deeper and more fundamental that causes the existence of morality. The same way that, for example, I think that things like logic just simply are and are necessary components of reality. Things like modal truths, where 1 + 1 has to equal 2 in all possible universes. I think that the question of where do those modal truths come from is something of a misnomer. They just sort of are, and they're a necessary component that is potentially realizable to rational persons.
Okay, so let's back up a little bit because you jumped over the logic. So with morality, all right, so you said that I guess your objective morality is and you would I guess connect that to a utilitarian understanding. Is that what you were saying?
Yes, I'm a utilitarian. I think that there are many things that are necessary that are not purely natural phenomenon, but that we think exist. Things like mathematical truths and modal truths, and I think moral truths would be one thing in that category.
All right, but do you think that as something that's okay from your perspective. You're an atheist, so everything is material, right? Everything is material, naturalistic materialism, correct?
Well, no. It depends on what you mean by material. So, I like one thing that Parfit said about this. Parfit's a philosopher who I'm quite fond of, which he said, I'm not a naturalist, not in the sense that I believe in ghosts, but in the sense that I believe in things like sets. And so I don't think that there are non-natural phenomenon like ghosts, but I do think that there are certain phenomenon that are not purely natural. For example, mathematical truths. I think that Fermat's last theorem would remain true even if there were no universe.
Is the reality of like 2 + 2 = 4? Is the reality of that rooted in just human consciousness, or is it rooted in materialism? What is it rooted in?
Well, I think that there are certain things that just are. There are certain. I think one of the things that just is 2 + 2 being equal to 4 as just a necessary fact. I don't think that that's the byproduct of human understanding. So and I don't think it's the byproduct of materialism. So if you had no people and no material in the universe, I think it would still be the case that the idea of two, if you add the idea of two on top of it, you would get four.
Okay, so let's go back to morality. Okay, so with the whole understanding of morality, if we hold to an objective standard, because if you're saying that your understanding of morality is the well-being, whatever is the most possible well-being for everyone. What if my well-being has to be is happen to be beating somebody up? That's my well-being. How do you justify that and give an ultimate standard to where everyone has to conform to that standard?
Well, I think that if you get well-being from beating people up, other people presumably would be caused a lot of suffering by you beating them up. And so I think that it would, in all cases, essentially be the case that beating someone up is almost always not conducive to societal well-being. And so thus, I'm generally, as a policy, opposed to beating people up. But if you're asking how I could convince an egoist who only cares about their own happiness to be moral, the unfortunate fact of the matter is I don't think that there is any argument that I could make to an egoist as to why they should be good. But I think that we can say in an objective sense that they're acting wrongly, that what they're doing is immoral. But going a bit back to the problem of evil point. So there are a lot of discussions about where morality comes from, what the nature of morality is, etc. But we can still have discussions about moral questions without resolving all of the meta-ethics of morality, which is currently hotly debated by philosophers. And it seems like any plausible account of morality would say that it's bad to cause babies to die for no reason. And so I think that we can before we even delve into the meta-ethics, we can just discuss the applied ethics. And I don't see any good reason as to why a perfect God would result in the deaths of thousands of babies every day.
Okay, so as a Calvinist myself, I would argue that the reason it was not God's original design for sin to be in the world. The fault, sin coming into the world was an issue that came about through the fall of Adam. All right, so it was God's original design for the world to be good. So I guess by you suggesting that it is this idea that God cannot exist because there are moral failures in the world. I don't think that jives, because what you're not proving that God does not exist. You're just saying that the particular God that you've conceived in your mind does not exist. How can you argue? How can you argue from the position of saying that, because immoral acts happen, therefore there is no God? How can you go from that to that?
Well, because I think that on the view of most people, including you say that God is all good. And I think that one entailment of being perfectly good is not killing babies for no reason. But in terms of the explanation that you gave based on Adam and original sin, I think that there are a few problems with that account of the existence of bad things in the universe. First of all, even if it were not God's original intent for Adam to have eaten the fruit from the tree and resulted in all these bad things, it was God who intentionally set up a mechanism, God who intentionally put the tree in the Garden of Eden, such that if Adam ate from the tree, it would result in terribly catastrophic outcomes. And so similarly to how I think that if I gave nuclear weapons to terrorists, even if it were not my intent that the terrorists would do it, if I knew beforehand, as God does, given that he's omniscient, that they would use it to blow up a city, I think that I would be acting wrongly. And likewise, I think that God was acting wrongly by setting up a mechanism for that had the capacity to cause so much suffering. I mean, he could have made it so that when people ate from the tree, it did not result in diseases killing thousands of people, and instead just resulted in, God coming down and giving them a stern talking to. Particularly because many of the people who are punished for the actions of Adam and Eve and for the original sin are not beings who took that action. And so the baby who dies at the age of a week old from starvation, they didn't eat the fruit from the tree. It's not their fault. The numerous animals in nature who live lives of immense suffering, they didn't eat from the tree, nor did any of their ancestors. And so I don't think that can provide a good account, because you have to explain why God set up a mechanism whereby the sin of man was able to cause so much harm.
Okay, so the understanding is that God, in his creation, God created it good. God planted this tree in the Garden of Eden in order to allow Adam. Adam made that decision. He made a conscious decision to sin against God. Right. So the whole idea is that as Adam ate that fruit, sin came into the world, things like that. So as being God, does not God have the right to do what he wants to do with his creation? He has that right because he is God. He would not be God if he did not have that right to do such.
Well, I don't know what it would mean for God to have the right. God clearly, on your view, would have the ability to do it. But whether it would be wrong for him to do it, I mean, it seems clear that if God created a bunch of beings and then just tortured them forever for no reason, that would be bad, even though they were his creations.
But that's the problem. It's not for no reason, because we're all fallen in sin. Just by our sheer condition, we've fallen under the wrath of sin. So it's not that God is just torturing anybody for no reason. We're under the wrath of God because we have sinned against God.
Right. The torturing everyone for no reason, it was drawing an analogy to disprove the claim that you had made previously, which is that God created us so he can do whatever he wants with us. I was arguing that you can have other justification that you give for why what God's doing is just, but the fact that God has created us does not by itself provide sufficient justification for a God mistreating us. But in terms of the thing that you said about how God just set up the tree, and then it was Adam's choice to take the tree, or to take the fruit from the tree.
Right.
I think that God could have made it so that a consequence of eating the fruit from the tree was not cholera being brought into the world, and was not malaria being brought into the world, such that the consequences of eating from the tree, there didn't have to be horrendous consequences of eating from the tree, much less every single one of the specific bad things in the world. It's not the case that every single one of them, just by logical necessity, had to be tacked on to the tree. So I ultimately think that neither of those provide a sufficient account for why there is suffering in the world.
I mean, but that's the thing, because from your position, I really don't see how you can make moral claims. That's a different thing. That's the thing I'm having trouble with, because you're arguing from a position that is inherently materialistic and naturalistic. So I don't see how you can make claims about something that's metaphysical, so something that's outside of the physical realm. I don't see how you can make claims. How can you justify your reasoning with in of your moral claims? How do you justify your reasoning in that claim?
Well, I mean, so in terms of how I justify the moral claims that I make, I think that we can sort of think through our intuitions. We can argue and debate about things that attempt to unify very different moral theories in an attempt to find consensus. But to be clear, I'm not a naturalist about all things. I think that certain things like mathematics and sets are not purely natural phenomena. They're not a byproduct of the natural world. But I still think that they exist. I think that likewise, morality can exist in a similar way.
But why? But why though? Why do you think these things exist? What do you think? Why? Because you can't just say, "Well, I think they exist," but justify them. Justify why you think these things exist. That's the problem that I'm having here. Is that you're saying that morals exist, logic exists, these things are immaterial, but yet you're not justifying them. You're just saying, "Well, they just exist." That doesn't explain anything. So do you believe that science can explain these things that are immaterial, like morals and logic? Do you think science has the ability to explain immaterial aspects?
I mean, maybe, probably not. There's probably no...
Okay, so if science, you just said probably not. So if science probably cannot explain these immaterial aspects, how can you justify the fact of logic and morals? How do you justify them? That's what I'm trying to get out of you. I want you to justify that, because you go around living your life every single day and you are walking around with this idea of morals, right? Every human being, the Bible says that every human being has God's law written on their heart. And that's why we act in the way that we act. That's why we behave when we see a child. That's why you're outraged about a baby being born or being killed by malaria, because you have a moral aptitude. And I agree. It's heartbreaking to see a child born with killed by malaria, or the eyes being eaten out by malaria. But my problem is that from the atheistic naturalistic perspective, I don't think you could justify that. You can't just say, well, they're immaterial, they just are. No, you cannot do that, because it becomes arbitrary. You can't just argue from an arbitrary position. You have to justify it. So I'm asking you to justify the morals, justify the logic.
Well, a few things. One, I'm not a naturalist, so I'm not arguing from an atheist naturalistic account. I'm a non-naturalist. I think that there are certain non-natural phenomena. Second, I think that there are certain things that simply are. I don't think that there's some deeper account of where they come from. And I think that you too think that you too would object to some deeper account of where they come from. You would say that, for example, God could not both exist and not exist at the same time, even if he wanted to, because there are certain laws of logic that God has to follow. Similarly, God could not make it right to torture babies for no reason. Even if God said that it was right, there's some fact of the matter that makes it so that God could not be justified if God just tortured infinite babies for no reason. So that shows that they can't be grounded in God. And so I think that they just are. They're just a necessary fact that pervades across all universes. They can't not be the case. And I don't see a reason to think that there's some deeper account that we're missing here. I just think that some things are.
But I think you're presupposing these ideas. You're saying, like, I operate in these type of functions of logic, morals, these type of things. But you're just saying they just are. Okay, so from the Christian perspective, we can ground the morals, we can ground the logic, and but they're rooted in the nature of God. That's who he is. That's who God is in nature. The logic, the morals, things of that, the immaterial aspects such as that, those are rooted. That's why I'm having trouble, because from your position, I don't see how you can justify that and hold value to children. How do you hold value to children? What are children? Are children, where do they value come from?
Well, I think that their value comes from the fact that they have the capacity for well-being and suffering. I think that we have reason to care about our own well-being, such that we would say that if a person, for example, spent their entire life just pressing a button for no reason, they were acting less than fully rationally. Because I think that we can have this sort of immediately realizable, self-evident reason for holding certain desires. And I think that sort of indicates that there is some moral realm. But I don't think that your account of morality or your account of logic is able to provide for this. So, for example, I think that if we could imagine it being the case that God's nature were different, and I think that if God's nature were different, it would still be wrong to torture babies. There's nothing about God's nature that could change such that it became morally appropriate to torture babies. There's nothing about God's nature that could make 1 + 1 = 5. because these are just necessary facts that are not explainable with simpler phenomena. They're just sort of brute facts.
All right, so they're brute facts. Huh? That's it. They're just brute facts. They don't have to they don't have to be justified or anything like that. Then.
Well, I mean, I think we can have justification for why we think that they exist. So I mean, I can get into why I think that mortal facts exist. But if you're asking for some deeper explanation of their etymology, I just don't think that there is one. Similarly to how, and I don't think that you think that there is one either, because you've agreed that they can't be grounded in God's nature. Because if they were grounded in God's nature,
I never said that God's morals and logic and the laws of logic are not grounded in God's nature. I believe that morals and the laws of logic are grounded in God's nature.
Well, okay, so if God's nature were different, then could it be okay to torture babies for no reason?
But I don't believe that God's nature is different. So,
right. So I know that you don't think that that is the case. The question is, if it were the case, would it be okay to torture babies? Because the same way that with like a scientific phenomenon, if we say that if you say that the cause of gravity is God's will, then if God's will were different, then the force of gravity would be different. If you say that things are grounded in God's nature, then it has to be the case that if we imagine God's nature being different, even though I know you don't think it is, but if it were different, you would have to say that the construct of morality would be entirely different. And yet, given that it's seemingly that no change in God's nature could ever make it be the case that it's okay to torture babies, I think demonstrates that there's an external phenomenon outside of God that God's nature is unable to explain. Because if God's nature were such that God's nature said that we should all torture babies, God's nature would be immortal in that sense. And so I don't think, given that it is a rule that not even God can violate, and not even God's nature can violate it, it clearly cannot be grounded in God's nature.
All right, let me see here. So you don't believe that there is. So how do you believe that there is no creator? Is there a creator? Or, do you? So you said the problem of evil is one of your criteria of why you don't believe God, that there's a creator God.
Right. I think that the problem of evil is the main reason why I'm not persuaded that there's an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent God. In terms of other conceptions of a God, for example, deistic accounts, which claim that there is a creator, but that creator is not all-knowing, all-powerful, or all-good, I don't think that those accounts are particularly plausible. They don't seem like the most likely explanation, but they seem quite a bit more likely than the account that says that God is perfect, all-knowing, and all-good. And so my main hesitation with believing in God is overcoming the problem of evil and similar surrounding problems. For example, the problem of mortal disagreement. If God writes a law in our hearts, why are the laws that are written in our hearts, why do they have so many contradictions? And why are there so many just errors in our hearts? It seems like following our hearts is not a great way of doing morality. And yet if God directly wrote a moral code on our hearts, then you would expect it to be a pretty good guidebook for morality.
Yeah, you just said, you just actually said something correct. Following your heart is definitely not a good way of following your morality, because the Bible says that your heart is deceptively wicked above all things. So yeah, the only way that you could come out of that is obviously repenting of your sins and coming to Christ. That is the goal there, and God would do a transformative work in your heart and work and bring you out of that sin. So I 100% agree with you when it comes to the morality in your heart is flawed, and that's because of the sinful nature, right? That's because of the sinful nature.
But I mean, if as you said earlier, that God writes the moral law directly on our hearts, why is the moral law that God's writing on our hearts having so many errors in it and is so misleading?
Because your sinful nature is creating this misleading understanding. So God writes the moral law in your heart. This is what you're operating on, right? This is why you're outraged at certain aspects, because you have God's fundamental objective standard on your heart, and that's good. But the idea is that our sinful nature corrupts those morals. They corrupt them. That's a part of our sin nature, is that it's corrupt. And because of a corrupt nature, we view things in a skewed way. So in other words, so just like you're saying like, oh, I don't like babies suffering. I agree with you. I don't like baby suffering either. But the idea is that you don't like baby suffering, not because it's fun, not because there's an objective standard above our standard that says that suffering, making baby suffer is wrong, but because of your standard that says that, right?
Well, no. I am a moral realist. I think that there is an objective standard outside of us that makes it wrong. Similarly to how I think if you make the claim that it's okay to kill babies, I think that you're making an error. Similarly to how if you make the claim that 1 + 1 is equal to 47, you're also making an error. I think that there are facts that we can discover about mathematics, about modal truths, about logic, and also about morality. But I don't think that your answer to the argument for moral disagreement is able to resolve much of the problem. So what you said is that we're corrupted by our sinful nature. But I don't think that explains why what's written on our hearts is in error, because often people will try to be doing what's good. So you have many people who I assume you would agree. I don't know what your position is on abortion, but let's just pretend you're pro-life for a minute. No doubt there would be many people who are good, loving, caring people who care about other people, who try to do what's best, and yet who think it's okay morally to get an abortion. They would perhaps say to you that what you think they're doing is entirely wrong. And yet they're not doing it out of malice. They're doing it out of being in error about what is actually right on your view. But why would God make it so that we don't know what is right and what is wrong? It seems
no. But we do know what's right and what's wrong. We do know. That's why we live our lives in such a manner of trying to do right and trying to do wrong. It's just that sometimes it's skewed because of our sinful nature. It's not this idea that you just have no idea what's right and what's wrong. You certainly know what's right and what's wrong. But the idea is that your sinful nature skews that view into where it could be self-gratifying. You're not thinking about the next person. These sinful, selfish desires, and that's what that sinful nature creates. So it's not this idea that you don't know what's right and what's wrong. You certainly do, and that's why you behave in such a manner. But what I still want you to do, because you're making a lot of moral claims, Matt. You're making a whole bunch of moral claims. I'm still looking for you to justify those moral claims within your worldview, and I don't think you've done that to a satisfactory level.
Well, I think I have. So in terms of I'll first address your solution to the argument for moral disagreement, and then I'll justify the moral claim. So in terms of your solution, so what you said is that it's not that we don't know right from wrong, it's that we do, but we become corrupted by our sinful nature. If we look around at the world, that just seems empirically false. I mean, it seems like there are many people who are utilitarians who think that utilitarianism is correct. There are many people who are deontologists who think that deontology is correct. There are many people who are virtue ethicists, think that virtue ethics are correct. And I don't think that it's motivated by selfishness. I think that if you asked them to just make a decision that had no impact on them, for example, if they would flip the switch in the trolley problem, I think many good people who want to do what's right, would flip the switch. Many people who want to do what's right wouldn't flip the switch. I don't think that there's some mortal law written on our hearts that just gives us immediate initial access to what is right in all of those on all of those issues.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you. So you said that you do not think that there is a moral law written on our hearts to say that one more time?
Yeah, what I said is that I think that we do have moral intuitions, but I don't think that in all cases we just know what is right and what is wrong, but then we choose to do what is wrong. I think that in many cases, many people who are good people disagree about what's right and wrong. They don't know. Some people think that one position is right. Some people think that another position is right. And ultimately, it can't be resolved by just deferring to people's hearts, because people have different views of what is right and wrong. And it's not motivated by being bad people or by self-interest. It's motivated by just genuine disagreement about right and wrong.
Okay, so you said that good people exist. Okay, so what is your grounding to say that good people exist? What is your grounding for saying that good people exist? What is your understanding of good? How is it good?
Well, I mean, I think I've given my account of what I think determines if something is good. I think that things are good if they produce more well-being than suffering. I think it's weird to judge people as good or bad. I mean,
why
I
is
think
that
that
weird?
generally,
Because hold on, because you said that it's wrong to judge people between good and bad, if they're good or bad. But you're sitting here right now and you're judging. You may not think God is a person. You may not think he exists, but to other people, God exists. So therefore, you're judging their God. You're making direct judgments on the God that other people serve. So you just said that you don't think it's good or bad, but you're making an inference on other people's God. All right. So once again, I need you to justify that, in that you have the right to judge people good or bad. And actually, if you said that you don't think it's right to judge people good or bad, how are you holding to what creates the better good or the greater good for everyone if you are now taking that good or bad platform away from yourself? I don't see how you justify that.
well, I think that events and actions can be good or bad. And we can refer to a person as being good or bad by looking at if their life brought about more well-being than suffering. And yet I think that in many cases, when we're talking about good or bad people, that's not the consideration that we're looking at. So, for example, I think that if when we're just in common parlance talking about a person being a bad person, we're not saying that their life on net had negative consequences. Rather, we're saying that that person did things that they knew were wrong and didn't care. We would, even if, like, I think if there was, for example, a politician who ended up, wait, sorry, can I just finish this point real fast?
Go ahead.
Yeah, who ended up passing really bad policies. I think that we would generally say that if they were, a person who helped out there at charity every Sunday and did what they thought was best, I think that even if they had negative effects on the world, we would say that they were a good person, in the sense that we wouldn't think that it was warranted to be rude to them, but they had bad outcomes. But when I say that God is bad, I'm more judging God's action based on God's action. So I'm saying that if there were a perfect God, the actions that that perfect being would take are out of accord with the actions that we see having been taken in the real world. And so there's not a perfect God. And my view says that we can condemn actions as being good or bad, but I just don't think it's generally practically useful to condemn people as being good or bad.
But why? Why is it generally not acceptable? Why?
Well, I mean, my moral view lays out that the things that we care about are well-being and suffering. And so I think that we can refer to people as being bad, just sort of not in the meta-ethical sense of this person caused more suffering than well-being, but just in sort of the more limited sense of that person is a jerk. But I think that any criterion which you use to determine if I think that the question of when we call people good or bad, it's more just sort of as a practical matter to pass judgment on them, but it's less an evaluation. It's sort of a different type of moral evaluation than when we call actions good or bad. Because when we call actions good or bad, we look at their consequences. But when we call people good or bad, I think that we generally don't look at the overall consequences of those people, given that there are consequences outside of your control, which I don't think you can be blamed for.
All right, so you pointed out you said earlier that they knew they were wrong. All right, so how does someone know that they are wrong? Does it come from the inside, or where does it come from?
Well, I mean, I think some people know that they're wrong, and it comes from them taking an action and feeling that they acted wrongly. But those aren't the type of people who I was talking about with the argument from moral disagreement. The type of people who I was talking about with the argument from moral disagreement were people who do what they think is right. And even after consulting their heart for a long time and thinking about what they think is right and wrong, they come to conclusions about what is right and wrong. And other people who consult their heart come to completely opposite conclusions about what's right and wrong. The problem is not that that people aren't consulting the law written on their hearts. The problem is that different people have different laws written on their hearts, so to speak, that result in different outcomes.
And I agree. So that's why I don't see how you can justify the understanding of that it's moral to try to do the most moral good for anyone. I don't see how you justify that, because everyone has a different outlook on what is moral, what is morally good. And unless you're reaching for a transcendent objective standard, then I think that's the only way you could ground any objective morals.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we do need an objective standard outside of us to ground morality. I think that there is an objective.
Where is it? That's the question I'm asking you. Where is, because you're saying that we're working for the greater good of everyone. All right. So if we're working for the greater good of everyone, then obviously everyone is making this decision, right? Everyone is making this decision to say, okay, this is good, this is bad. Where are they getting the foundations for that understanding of good and bad? You can't just say that, oh, everyone's working for the greater good, because everyone has their own understanding of what greater good is. So I'm asking you, what is the standard beyond that? Where is it? Where does it come from? And how do you justify it?
Well, I mean, again, I think I've answered that. I think that there's nothing, it's not reducible to anything simpler. Similarly to how we would say, if you make the claim that 1 + 1 is equal to 27, we would say you're committing an error. I think that there's no simpler thing that mathematics can be broken down into. There are just these base mathematical truths. Likewise, I just think that there are these base moral truths. And then in terms of how we come to know them, I think that through debate and argumentation and contestation over ideas, we can come to know ideas about morality. So, and I think that can be seen empirically with moral views shifting over time. So I think in many decades ago, non-cognitivist views of morality were more common. I think now cognitivist views, according to the last Phil Paper survey, I think made up the views of 78% of philosophers. My prediction is that I think that more and more philosophers will tend towards consequentialism. I think that we have decisive reason for choosing consequentialism over other moral theories, and we can argue about them. So, for example, one reason why I think consequentialism is a good way to make decisions is I think it's simple and clear. It has great explanatory power, and it provides concrete implications for how to act in any situation. So you don't need to have these complex, multifaceted rules. It's just a fairly simple procedure. Another argument that I would provide for consequentialism is that if we want to look at where value comes from, we should look at what things, if they stopped existing, would result in value going away. And I think that that well-being and suffering provide an account of that. So if no one was ever happy or sad, I don't think anyone would matter. But I don't think that it's grounded in what a deontologist would say, for example, of something in the choices that we make. Because I think you could imagine a world with plants that are sentient, where they can feel pleasure and pain. And I think it would still be bad for them to suffer for no reason, even if they can't actually make decisions, if they can still experience well-being and suffering. And I mean, we can go back and forth in terms of the arguments for and against different moral views. But I've given an account of why I think morality exists. We can sort of see it in the world.
That's the thing. I don't think you did. I don't think you gave an account of why you think morality exists. You're just saying that, it's just something that's there, basically. And in layman's terms, I'm not quoting you directly, but you're just saying, it's just something that exists. You're not justifying anything, Matt. There's nothing being justified here.
Well, I mean, so I can give an account of what things in the world lead me to the conclusion that there is some moral force.
But that's not what I'm asking you. I'm asking you, what is the ultimate justification? That's what I'm asking you.
Right, and I've explained that I don't think that there is some simpler unit that morality can be broken down into, similarly to how I don't think that there's some simpler unit that logic can be broken down into. I just think that there are these base moral facts about morality, similarly to how there are about logic. in terms of how we come to know these. So one argument that I find pretty persuasive is an argument provided by Parfit, which is I think that we can have reasons to care about things. So for example, if there was a person who was, when making decisions, they planned to maximize their well-being and to minimize their suffering, except they just ignored all suffering that would occur on future Tuesdays. I think that we would say that that person is irrational, that they're committing a mistake of some sort. It just seems wildly counterintuitive to say that that person who's just enduring infinite suffering on Tuesday to forego a minuscule pinprick on Wednesday, even though on Tuesday they are in sheer agony and regretting every minute of the decision that they made in the past. I think that it just seems very clear to most reasonable people that that person is being irrational, which I think points to there being some external moral standard. And so I think that when we just see the badness of suffering in the world, when we see people pain, and when we experience our own suffering, we just see that we have reasons to avoid that suffering, which aren't provided by our desires, but rather are independent of our desires. And so, just to be clear, so what you're asking me to do is something that I don't think can be done in the first place, because I don't think that there's some simpler thing that morality can be boiled down into. I think that morality is just sort of a base fact that similar to mathematical and moral facts. I've given you an account of how that is coherent, and I've given you an account of why I think that exists. I've also explained why I don't think that God is able to ground that, because if God's nature were different, we would still say that morality is the same. God's nature changing wouldn't be able to make it okay to torture people, which I think shows that your view cannot ground morality any more than mine. But so if we hold on.
No, because I believe in the God of the Bible. So I don't believe that God's nature can change. So that's why I can ground him. I can ground him in the God of the Bible. So you're creating these, this idea, well, if God's nature changed, I don't think you can. But I don't believe that God's nature can change. Even in a hypothetical, I don't believe that God's nature could change. So I can ground him. I could ground I could ground my morals. I can ground my logic. I have a rooted cause of those intuitions that I have. But from your perspective, I don't see how you ground them. I don't see how you come to a reasoning understanding of the moral. So you're an atheist. So you're not a naturalist. So what do you are you a proponent of evolution, or what's your position?
Yes.
All right. So you're
strong proponent of evolution.
Okay, you're a proponent of evolution. So in essence, we came from a biological slime and eventually evolved into what we have today, to present day. Is that a basic fundamental landscape of what happened?
I think it's slightly inaccurate to say that we started as slime. We started as single-celled organisms that were not slime. Okay. But yeah, we did evolve from simpler organisms to more complicated ones.
All right, fair enough. I didn't get the exact terms, but I understand what you're saying. All right, so what? Okay, a lot of logic, a lot of reasoning, a lot of morals has been claimed today on your part. So, what do you believe that there's chemicals firing off in your brain? What do you believe is going on there?
I think that there are chemicals firing in your brain, but I think that to say that it's merely chemicals firing in your brain would be in some sense the fallacy of composition. So I think that the whole can be greater than the sum of its parts. And so the experience of a baby suffering as it's starving to death, that negative experience, it's not just atoms, because those atoms lead way to a unified consciousness, and the consciousness has the capacity for worthwhile or not worthwhile conscious experience.
Where does consciousness come from?
Well, I mean, that's a pretty big question. I don't really know. One view that a friend of mine proposed that seems fairly reasonable is that consciousness is just this irreducible property of the world that's produced through integrated information. So the same way that when we ask for in physics what charge emerges out of, there isn't an answer to that question. Charge is just an irreducible property of matter. I think that the view that he outlined, which seems plausible, is that consciousness is just some irreducible property of certain types of matter. And he proposed that it's produced through integrated information, so complex information schemes. I mean, that might be right. I don't. To me, it seems more plausible that it would emerge just as a byproduct of natural selection. So, as a byproduct of if there was this consciousness thing that could exist in principle, there are strong evolutionary reasons as to why beings that are conscious would survive more than beings that are not conscious. So, from natural selection, you would be likely, and we assume that consciousness is a coherent concept, which it seems to be the case. Like I know that I'm conscious. I think that we can say that it emerges from it. But the point of science is we don't have to have answers to all of these difficult questions. But just because we can't answer the question of where something came from does not mean that we should just assume that it came from God, given that when people have tried to explain phenomenon with God, they've almost always been wrong. And so there's a pretty strong probabilistic argument as to why, if you try to explain a phenomenon by appealing to God, given that it's failed the last 50 times people have tried to do it, it's likely to fail this time.
Would you say that science disproves God?
No, I think that science perhaps gets rid of the need for God, but I don't think that I think that we have to engage in philosophical argument in order to rule out the possibility of a God. I don't think. I mean, it's possible that at some point we will discover some element of science. I don't even. It's hard to conceive of what this would be, but that would rule out God. So, for example, if we discover that, like, I mean, it's hard to think of a good example, but yep. Currently, I don't think that science rules out God. But I think that it reduces the need for God and reduces the number of phenomenon that we need God to explain.
Okay, so you said science, I guess, gets rid of the need for God. Is that what you said? Science gets rid of the need for God?
I mean, I think that science allows us to explain phenomenon without God, and so if we had,
so science is rooted in the ability to observe, right? So it's observation, right? So how do you observe? How do you observe logic? How do you observe that?
Well, I don't think that logic is a scientific. The existence and emergence of logic,
and that's exactly my point. Is that you cannot?
Well, right, I think that.
You cannot observe it.
I think. Well, no, I think that that's true. But again,
I think that, so we can't observe it, but we have it. Would you agree?
Well, I mean, I think that we can conceive of it. There's no test that we can do to see logic. I mean, we sort of can test logical and mathematical truth. So, for example, if we can test 2 plus 2 by looking at. By looking at if we have 2 things and add 2 things on top of it, we see that we get 4 things. But I agree, we can't ultimately test certain things, which is why I'm not a naturalist. I think that there are certain things that are not merely physical.
So you're not a naturalist, then okay. I'm trying to get you to center in. Okay, center in on. Okay, you're saying that science. Not necessarily disproves that God exists, but it disproves the need for God. It disproves the need for God. So if science is rooted in the ability to observe the physical world, how can science disprove the need of God, something that is not physical? How is that even possible?
Well, no, I don't think that science will ever make it so that God is not needed to explain things like the laws of logic. I think that we need philosophical arguments to examine why God is not needed to explain those things. But I think that science has been able to explain why God is not needed to explain why we have such a rich diversity of different types of life.
But hold on. But Matt, you just said that the laws of logic you cannot observe. Once again, science is dealing with the physical world. The laws of logic are immaterial. Morals are immaterial. So how do you justify that statement that you said when it comes to logic and morals. And you're saying that we can just root it in philosophy. No, that doesn't argue the point. That doesn't ground the point. Because once again, you're still not justifying in this idea of science, the physical world, observing the physical world, you're still not grounding the understanding of the morals and the logic. We have them, but yet they're immaterial. So I don't think you're. Right. I don't think you're properly grounding them. At least not satisfactory anyway.
Well, no, I agree. I don't think that science has the ability to ground the laws of logic. I think that to clarify the position is that I think that there were certain things that it used to be difficult to explain absent a God. So, for example, things like why there are so many animals that seem well suited to the world around them, etc. Then we discovered that evolution by natural selection is a thing. And so that allowed us to explain those things. But I don't think that science is able to explain every single thing. I don't think that it's able to explain logical truths, nor mathematical truths, nor moral truths. And so I think that science is able to explain, I think, natural phenomenon, but the phenomenon that I don't think are purely natural, I don't think science is sufficient to explain them. And just in terms of the natural versus non-natural divide, it's not the case that all atheists have to be purely naturalists about things. So, for example, Parfit, who's one of the most renowned philosophers of the last century, who I quite like, he was not a naturalist. I mean, my view is quite similar to his, that I think that these are not empirically discoverable facts about the natural world, but they're just grounded in our capacity we can discover them via reasoning and via applying like our human capacity for reasoning. And so I don't see why the fact that God, my view is not that science explains everything that you can use God to explain, that science explains many things that God had previously been used to explain.
So you said, okay, so you said that science, go back, you said something about reasoning. Say that one more time. Say that one more time.
Yeah, I think that there are certain discoverable facts about the world that are not purely physical. So, for example, I think that we can discover moral facts. I think that we can discover logical facts, mathematical facts. And those are not empirically testable as much as they are just sort of derivable by reason alone.
All right. So if you're reasoning, well, let me retract that. So if you're grounding your reasoning, okay. So what are you grounding your reasoning in? What is that grounded in?
Well, I mean, I think that the process of evolution by natural selection resulted in us having the capacity for reason, given that it advanced our evolutionary survival. And I think that since we have these capacities, we can apply them to complicated situations. So, for example, if you see 3 lions go into a thicket and 2 come out, there are main survival benefits to realizing that there's still 1 lion in the thicket. And I think that those reasoning skills, which are useful biologically, have been honed and have the ability to be cross-applied across domains, such that now we're able to do calculus with them.
Okay. Let me, I think we got some questions here. Let me throw some of these questions at you real quick. All right, we got this one coming up. There it is from Atomic Apologize. Thank you for the super chat, Atomic. Appreciate you. Question for DD. Your argument is because evil exists, God can exist. Is it logical to also think if God exists, then God exists?
The question is, if good exists, then God exists.
Yeah, I guess if good exists, I'm sorry. Yeah, if good exists, then God exists. Yeah.
Well, no, of course not, right? So I think that if there were a God, we would expect the design of the universe to be designed the best it possibly could. I think that the existence of good does disprove a all evil God, but I don't think that it proves an all good God, because I think that we can have good, on my view, if it's not grounded in, if it's, a non-purely natural fact, the way that I tend to account for morality, or the way that most philosophers, who the majority of whom believe in moral realism, the majority of philosophers think morality is objective, and the majority of them are also atheists. I think that most philosophers think that we can have a reasonable account of where good comes from without a god, and for the reasons like Euthyphro's dilemma, which I hashed out a little while ago. It can't be grounded in the existence of God, because if it were, then if you change God's nature, which seems at least logically possible, then the things that are morally obligated would be entirely different, which seems implausible. It seems like you couldn't change God's nature to make murdering babies permissible.
All right. Let me see. I have a couple more questions here to try to get the audience involved a little bit. I think I have another super chat here, at least I think anyway. Let me see. Here's another question for you. How can you do science without God when science is about knowledge? How do you get knowledge without God?
Well, I mean, I think that we can make testable predictions about the way the world is. So we can say, if this theory is true, then you would expect this thing to happen. Then we test it. We see that that thing does happen, which confirms our theory. I don't see why God is necessary to ground our capacity for reasoning, because I think that evolution provides a reasonable account of why we would have the capacity for reason.
Well, I think the idea is because in science we sometimes perceive things as inductive, right? Inductive reasoning, right? Where we have a high percentage of that because we observed this in the past. This will happen in the future. How do you get that from an atheist position? Well,
okay. In terms of it'll be hard to answer to solve the problem of induction and a quick answer. There's been a lot of literature about this. I think that there are answers to the problem of induction, but I think they require a sort of more nuanced analysis than can be given in 30 seconds. I think that for a person who, one, we can have just a reasonable decision-making account of why we would believe induction. So we might say that even if you don't think that if you think that induction may or may not be reliable, then if induction is not reliable, then we can't make predictions about anything. But if induction is reliable, then we can make predictions. So we should act as if induction is reliable, even if we have some amount of uncertainty. And also, if we assign the prior probability of induction being reliable and of induction being unreliable at about equal, and then we see that inductions work every time in the past, then that gives us a strong inductive argument for induction, so to speak.
I mean, I just find it interesting that that it's just continuing if we do this, if we do that. Like I appreciate things to be like solidified. You know what I mean? Like we have this understanding that this is exactly why it happens. Why things happen. It just seems like there is this idea that almost like it's like if and maybes. It's just a bunch of that. It seems like that's what you're saying. But I don't know. You want to clarify that? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, there's obviously a desire for everything to be very orderly and clear and well regimented. I think that unfortunately, when we look around the world and observe the data, there just aren't simple answers to these questions as much as that we would like them, as much as we would like for there to be simple answers to these difficult questions.
But I think there is an answer to these questions, Matt. I think it is an answer to these questions. But it's not an answer. Yeah, of course. Because I think that's what grounds our understanding of how we experience life. I just don't think from the atheist position, you can ground how we experience life, why is this good? Why is this bad? Why do I think this way? Why do I have to reason in this manner? I don't think you can ground that. We can go, like I said, we can go to a whole bunch of philosophical jargon, but that's not grounding anything. I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's becoming arbitrary. I think that the position becomes arbitrary because at the end of the day, it's like, well, it just is. No, well, that's not good. That's not how we reason, right? We don't reason that way.
Well, I've given an account of how I think we ground these things. I think that they certainly can't be grounded in God, because if they were if you say that something is grounded in God, then you have to say that if whatever element of God grounds it, that if that were different, then the thing that is grounded in God would be different. And yet that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like you couldn't change any part of God's nature to make it okay to eat babies. It's not a byproduct of God's nature, because there are certain constraints that not even God's nature can violate. In terms of, and I certainly don't think that God can ground induction, because if you didn't have induction prior to the existence of God, well, then God in one moment is omnipotent, but if we don't have induction, then maybe God will the next moment stop being omnipotent. And so if you already have to assume.
But it's not induction grounded in the uniformity of nature? Is not inductive grounded in the uniformity of nature?
Well, I think we can observe induction in the uniformity of nature, but I think that in order for God to make anything, you have to have the rules of the past continue into the future. And so I think that if you have to already have all these things in order for God to do anything, in order for God to be coherent, then you can't use God to explain any of these things if they already have to exist for God to exist.
If they are, what do you mean by that? What do you mean they already have to exist? What do you mean by that?
Well, if induction would, if there was no reason to think that the rules of the past will continue into the future, then when God was sitting upon his omnipotent throne, for one moment being omnipotent, there would be an equal chance that the next moment he would stop being omnipotent. And then, so you already have to have it be the case that there's some predictable set of rules whereby if God's omnipotent one moment, he'll probably be omnipotent the next moment.
Yeah, I would say those predictive rules are grounded in God's nature, though. I mean, that's why we observe the things that we observe.
But you already have to have them for God's nature to be coherent, because otherwise God's nature could be changed. If you already have to have those in order for God's nature to make sense, then you can't use God's nature to explain those things that are required for God's nature to emerge in the first place.
Are you saying that God is contingent on other things outside of him to, I guess, exist, or his nature to exist? Is that what you're saying?
Well, no, I'm saying that there are certain things about the universe that it seems like God would be entirely unable to violate. So, I mean, moral rules would be one of them. God couldn't violate those, so we've ruled those out as being grounded in his nature. God's nature being different couldn't violate logical rules, so those can't be grounded in God's nature. It couldn't violate mathematical rules if his nature were different. And induction is required for God's nature to even be a coherent concept. And so all these things that you're using God's nature to explain, God's nature cannot explain any of those. But on your view, you cannot explain why, for example, so many babies die of malaria every year. And I think that
I've already explained that. I explained that because it's a sinful world that we live in. That's why things like this happen. But I guess I'm trying to go back. You said, I'm still not understanding what you're saying, because you're saying that God's nature cannot explain logic because, I guess I'm not understanding what you're saying. I'm still not clear on exactly what you're saying.
Right. So God's nature cannot explain logic because in order for logic to, because a change in God's nature. So if you say that A is grounded in B, then a change in A would be able to change the nature of B. So if you say that I am grounded in my mother, then if my mother were different and had done different things, then I could be different. And yet if God's nature were different, there's no way that God could make it so that modus ponens is false.
But God's nature, but God's nature does not change. That's what grounds it. That's what grounds it in the first place.
Right. I know you think that God's nature doesn't change, but the question is not does it change? The question is if it did change. And I don't see, there's nothing logically incoherent about presupposing God's nature changing. I know you don't think it does, but we can still imagine worlds in which things that don't happen now, we can imagine worlds in which they did happen. And likewise, we could imagine a world in which God's nature were different. And on your view, you would have to say that in that world, if God's nature were different, such that God's nature said it was okay to kill babies, then it would be okay to kill babies. And yet that view does not seem particularly plausible.
All right, next question. We have another question here. From Duncan, what's up, Duncan? Matt, you believe in evolution. In which lab were you able to repeat the evolutionary process? If you haven't, why do you believe in the myth? Where did you get your faith?
Okay, a lot of aspersions on evolution cast in one question. So I think that we see on a smaller scale evolution happening. We see over time that organisms evolve in ways that make them more evolutionarily fit. So, for example, we see the coronavirus evolving. We can see that on a small scale because viruses have very, very short life cycles, and so we see it evolving. We also see on smaller scales too. We see, for example, houseflies evolving into very different things. And so, given that we see a continuum of things change over time, and we have good geological explanations why we think that the Earth is old and why we think that there were things that were around billions of years ago. We have a good account of, so we saw that there were simple organisms, and then we saw more and more complex organisms over time as time passed in correspondence with what we would expect on the evolutionary view. I mean, and so now what people will often claim is that there's some distinction. So things can evolve, things can change within their kind, but they can't become an entirely different kind. And yet that response fails because you ask what a kind is, and there are sort of two options for what you say is a kind in the biblical sense. One is you say a kind is something that's able to bring forth. And that view fails because we've seen houseflies we've bred houseflies like over the course of like 15 generations, and the descendants are no longer able to breed with each other. And so it can't be grounded in being, and so we do see that change over time. And yet if you just say, as people do, just appeal to the implausibility. So say, like, we are a different kind of thing than a dog. And even if two dogs aren't able to reproduce with each other, they're still dogs. But we are people. We're very different. That's true. We are different from dogs. But you can get these major differences by making a series of smaller differences. And so if we start out with a short tail, we start out becoming like, if we over time grow some amount of fur, we become less and less intelligent, etc. Eventually, enough small changes, which we observe happening, would result in a large change from a human into a dog. If you can imagine that happening. And so we observe these changes happening, and we have predictions. Those predictions end up being accurate. So we think that evolution is accurate. There's a reason why above like 90% of reputable biologists think that evolution is true. I think it's above 95% or something, because there's just no current scientific debate amongst people who have really studied the issue. So it's not some vacuous faith in evolution, but rather it's an observance of what the evidence shows, and the evidence shows definitively that evolution is the case.
All right, I have another question here. What's up, Travis? Thank you for the question. From Matt, what's your response to the claim that naturalism must posit more brute facts, including objective morality, than something like theistic idealism?
The view that I've explained why I don't think that these things that we generally think of as being brute facts, why they cannot be grounded in God's nature. So you can't ground morality in God's nature, because if you could, then God's nature changing could change morality. And yet many of us who have a view of what morality is would reject the possibility of, if God's nature changed, of that making it okay to torture babies. And so that means that on the theistic view, you have to posit everything that atheists have to posit, but then you also have to posit God. And you have to posit a God who, if there were a God, you would make certain predictions, and then those predictions don't match the real world. And so I think we have very strong both reason for just the sake of theoretical elegance and simplicity to assume that there's no God, and also just in terms of the data that we see in the world to think that there is not, in fact, a God.
All right. I think I have another question here. Here's another question. What's up, Chris? How's it going, buddy? Ask him how he can tell someone else they are wrong if they disagree with him.
Well, I mean, so I think that we can argue and hash it out with discussing and debating ideas. I think that it's difficult to change people's minds about morality. But I think that that's true of a lot of things. It's difficult to change. It's difficult to change people's minds about political issues, for example. And yet, I don't think that that means that there's that we need to posit God to provide that disagreement doesn't mean that there's no right answer. It just means that it's very hard to figure out what the right answer is. And so the arguments that I've provided before about how if we want to determine what's right, we look at the things whose absence would make it so that there is no morality, then that's a good way of grounding morality. And if we look at what those things are, those things seem to correspond. It seems like well-being is the best way, is the only thing that meets that criterion. If we look at what a rational self-interested agent would desire, given that they only care about what's good for them, and then we just apply that as a broad rule, so achieve that for all people, then we could ground that. If we look at, for example, the veil of ignorance, which ensures impartiality, and then what one would do from behind the veil of ignorance, Harsanyi proved, I think, that you would be utilitarian from behind the veil of ignorance. The point of these is not to go into immense detail here about all the arguments that I would employ, but rather to demonstrate that there are arguments that can be employed as to why my view is better than the view of a deontologist, for example. And then we can argue about it. And I think that similarly to how in science, there are different views of elements of the universe, whether there's a multiverse, whether the many worlds interpretation is true, for example. The way that we parse that out is by arguing and looking at the data and making predictions, etc. And I think we do a similar thing with morality.
Okay. But let me see something. Hold on. So, all right. So the question that was previously asked was, how can you tell someone that they are wrong? I believe that was the question, basically the question I was asked, right? I think that was the last question I was asked. Let me bring it back up.
Yeah.
It says, how can you tell someone else they are wrong if they disagree with you? So that...
Well,
I think that's what I've been saying the whole time is that, okay, we have this community and we say, okay, we need to make sure that we're doing a greater good for everyone. We need to make sure we're doing the best we can for everyone. But everyone does not hold to the same deal. You can go from one household to the next household, and they will have a different moral system to some degree. So,
well, right.
So, okay. So, are these laws that you would reference to say, okay, we need to abide by these moral laws, and this is the greater good for everyone? Where do you get your system at? Where do you get your system to say, this is where it's at? This is where it needs to be good. Where everyone will be good.
So where I get mine from, so I look at the moral intuitions that we have. I look at the best explanation of those. I try to provide a series of arguments as to why my view is correct after thinking a lot about morality and trying to come to conclusions about which moral view is correct. In terms of how I would say to someone that they're wrong, I would turn to them and I would say, you're wrong. And then I would give the arguments as to why they are in fact wrong.
But I think I'm right, though. I think I'm right.
Right.
It makes me feel good to do whatever you claim. It ain't even got to be nothing that's just absolutely atrocious. It could be simply, it could be me saying you're not smart or something that's not egregiously wrong, right? But to me, I feel good about it. It's my greater good. So what gives you the right to impose your moral position on me?
Well, I think
from your position, of course. From your position, of course.
Yeah, I think that there are two very different sets of people for whom we have to between whom we have to distinguish. One of them is people who agree with me about right and wrong, but they just don't really care. So they think that so they think that it's bad to torture infants, but they don't care, and then they torture infants.
Right.
I don't think that there's anything that I can say to convince those people that they're wrong, because I don't think that they're making any factual mistake about what's valuable. They're just being an asshole. They're just not caring about other people. I don't think that there's some argument I can make as to why they should stop being a good person, but I think that if we want society to do as well as possible, we should pass laws to make sure that people, can't harm other people. But in terms of if people hold genuine moral disagreements, so if a person is a deontologist, for example, I think that we can argue and use evidence and reason and arguments as to why my view is correct. So an example is, so I think that we have an moral obligation to give a large amount to charities that are particularly effective.
Why no, hold on. Why do I have a moral obligation to give to charities? Why?
Well, so my view is that because it maximizes well-being. But in terms of someone who isn't convinced of that view, so the argument I would make to them is the Peter Singer's drowning child argument. So suppose that you were walking by a pond and you saw a drowning child in the pond. And the only way to save the drowning child was to wade into the pond and ruin your $2,500 suit. That's the only way to do it. Would you have a moral obligation to wade into the pond to do it? Most reasonable people would say yes. And so then the question is, okay, if you donate $2,500, you can save the life of a child. What's the morally relevant difference between the two? And then we examine the different differences that people propose and see if they provide a reasonable count or if they don't provide a reasonable count. I don't think that there's a reasonable moral difference that people can come up with. And so thus, I think that that's sort of how we come to conclusions about morality. It's not like there's it's not the case that it's impossible for people who don't believe in God to argue about morality. We can argue in other ways. And in fact, philosophers have many meaningful, interesting, substantive disagreements about morality.
I agree that you guys have the right, because I believe that you're a moral agent, right? I agree with that. I'm not saying that atheists, I don't think you're saying that I'm saying that atheists or anyone that's not a Christian or have a theistic worldview cannot argue about morals. What I'm saying is that you can't justify it. You can't ground it.
I think I can. I think that for the reasons that I've given, it can't be grounded in God's nature. So it just has to be a brute fact. I think it is a brute fact.
But brute facts don't justify anything. They don't just. Well, they just is. I mean, they just is. Well, then it becomes arbitrary.
Just is.
No, that's not how we. No, that's not. That is not how we reason, Matt. You know that. That's not how we reason.
No, I mean, so
it just.
I'm not saying that. Well,
really,
that's the etymological account of its nature. Now, how we come to know that it exists is a very, very different question from what results in its origin. And so the question of how I know, for example, that there's an intruder in my house is very different from how that intruder began to exist. I don't have to know the name of their parents to know that there's an intruder in my house, but I do to know how they were brought into existence. And so I think that the account of how morality was brought into existence, I don't think that there is a simpler account. I think that it's just a necessary fact that exists across all possible universes. But that we know
what makes a fact? You said a necessary fact. It's a brute fact.
I mean, you're asking for a deeper explanation and for some.
I am asking for a deeper explanation because I don't think that you're properly grounding it. I don't think you're properly grounding it. That's why I'm asking for a deeper explanation. We can't just say, oh, we got morals, but they're just is. It just is morals, or we got logic and it just is logic. No, that's not how we reason. Well, that goes 100% against how we reason. We're always looking for fact. We're always looking for evidence to back things up. By nature, we are creatures created by God who look for these type of things. We discover we're made in this way. So by us just saying, oh, it just is, it goes totally against the way that human beings reason and think. 100%.
The account that I'm providing is not an account of how we come to know that these things exist. You're asking me what the origin is, what provides for these things' existence. I think that how we come to know
from an atheistic worldview, what is the origin of these things that we experience on a daily basis, that we're doing right now? Logic, reasoning, morals, the whole nine. Where is this stuff? Where is it rooted at? And it just can't be, well, it just is, because it's arbitrary and that's incoherent. So I'm asking you, where is that grounded?
Arbitrary. I see that the same way that you would think that it wouldn't be a sensible question to ask why God exists. God just is. God, you posit God as a brute fact that just is. I think that morality is a brute fact that just is. We know that it exists because, as you said, we experience it, quote, on a daily basis. I think that it's difficult, given that you have not made given a response to the argument as to why it can't be grounded in God. Because if it were grounded in God, then changing God's nature would change what is right and wrong. And so in a world where where God had a different nature, it could be okay to torture babies. And yet it doesn't seem logically possible for there to be a possible world where it's okay to torture babies for no reason. So I think that proves that your view can't account for it. So you're in the same epistemological boat as I am. We both have to posit these brute facts. You just have to also
no. I don't think so. I don't think so. Because once again, I don't believe that God's nature could change. You're depositing all these if and buts. Maybe if we lived in a different reality. Well, we live in a reality that we live in right now. And that's what I'm saying. We can go through all the hypotheticals we want to go to. But what I'm saying is that the God I serve, the God of the Bible, his nature does not change. And because his nature does not change, that's why we have the moral intuitions that we have. That's why we have the parameters of logic and reasoning that we operate off of.
Right. I know that you think that his nature does not change. Do you think that there's some logical impossibility of his nature changing?
There is a logical impossibility of his nature changing. He will not change. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever.
What would be logically impossible about his nature changing?
Logically impossible. He cannot make a round square. He can't do anything that's contradictory to his nature.
Okay, so right, and so why does that mean that his nature can't change?
Because it's grounded, because the things that we operate of is grounded in his nature. The idea of his nature changing would not be consistent with who he is. If the testimony of the scriptures is saying that he's the same yesterday, today, and forever, then that would be incoherent to his nature of who he is. That's why it would not be logically possible for his nature to change, or would be logically incoherent for me to say or agree with you and say, yeah, his nature could possibly change.
Well, I mean, so all that you said is that if his nature changed, then that couldn't happen because, the scripture says that his nature can't change. He's the same today, yesterday, and tomorrow. But that's not a logical reason why his nature can't change. That's just a fact about him that you posit. You just say that his nature doesn't change. And yet we can imagine it being the case that his nature changed. And it seems like if you have a plausible view of morality, then it would have to be the case that in hypothetical worlds that are not logically impossible, that it would result in acceptable conclusions. And yet, unfortunately, your view in hypothetical worlds that we can logically imagine results in wildly implausible implications, such as it being okay to harm babies for no reason. So, I mean, if you say that X is grounded in Y, then if X were different, it would have to be the case that Y would be different. And yet, if God's nature were different, you wouldn't accept that logic would be different. You wouldn't accept that mathematics would be different. So it can't be grounded in that.
Man, Matt, I think we go go ahead and agree to disagree on this, man. But I'm gonna shut this thing down, man. But I thank you for joining me, man. And like I said, I do want to get you on for a debate with someone. So I'll be reaching out to you to get you on for a debate. But before I let you go, Matt, I do want to just express to you that it's imperative that you repent. You repent of your sins, man. I mean, it's a lot of you have a lot of these arguments, right? And a lot of these arguments are in hostility to the Lord. All right. So I think that I really pray that God does amazing work in your heart, man, and that he changes your heart. I got love for you, Matt. I don't know you, but I still love you, man. And I'm praying that God will do an amazing work in your heart and that you will one day come to faith. We had a small conversation before this stream that maybe by 24 years old, you'll be a Calvinist. And I'm praying that you will be a Calvinist, man. And and I do appreciate you coming on here, man. You got school and everything. I appreciate you taking time out your schedule to come on. And, Jesus Christ died and bled on the cross. He bled and died on the cross, resurrected on the third day, man. And I'm just praying that God will do amazing work in your heart and that you will come to Christ, man. And I'm begging you to repent of your sins, because God's wrath is on you, man. Come to salvation, all right?
All right. I mean, I appreciate those statements, though. I would question why an all-knowing and all-loving God would torture me for no reason simply because of my lack of belief. But that's something that we should hash out in further conversation.
We're going to close this out with, it's not simply from your lack of belief, because all of humanity is hostile towards God. It's enmity, hostility. And in your nature, in your condition, you're corrupt. Your nature is corrupt. And because of the sin that you do, the sin that you carry on in your life, and because of that, God is hostile towards you, and you're hostile towards God. God is angry with the sinner every day. So it's important, and God is just in condemning those who violate his law, who go against his law. So from our perspective as finite beings, we can't not say, well, I don't see how God is justified. Well, God is God, and God can do what he want to do with his creation.
Yeah, I mean, I would obviously disagree with everything that you just said, but got to wrap this up at some point. Yep. Talk about it sometime in the future. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, no problem, man. Thank you once again, and I'll be reaching out to you. All right, Matt?
Great. Sounds good. Thank you. Bye.
All right, take care. All right, folks. What do you guys think, man? What do you think? What do you think, man? What do you think, man? Interesting conversation. This is probably like my second conversation of me actually interacting with someone who disagrees with me live on the Gospel Truth. So I know that, I was able to get the gospel to him. I was able to preach the gospel to him, tell him about the Lord Savior Jesus Christ. So obviously that's the ultimate goal in these kind of conversations, right? That's why we call this the Gospel Truth. It's not about just discussing ideas. It's about reaching the masses with the love of Christ, right? So as we approach these things and we digest these things, digest these ideas, Matt said a whole lot of stuff, right? He said a whole lot of stuff. And, he was inconsistent with the understanding of morality. He was inconsistent with the understanding of morals. A lot of his position was arbitrary, inconsistent, incoherent. Well, it just is. It just is. It just is. Hold on, you got to ground this stuff. You can't just make statements and not ground this stuff, right? Because human beings, we don't operate like that. That's not how we are. That's not what we made. That's not how God has created us, right? We have a grounding, and our grounding is in Christ. So I look forward to doing more of these discussions. I look forward to having more discussions. I don't know. I like talking to atheists. I think atheists are fun to talk to. I think they're interesting, and I want to get better at it, right? I want to get better at these type of conversations. All right. So I am going to sign off, and the next show that's coming up is with Pastor Doug Wilson, and we'll be talking about reforming marriage. So all my married couples out there, make sure you tune in. All those who plan on getting married, make sure you tune in. All right, because it's going to be a great show. But this show was interesting. And I just want to, before I get out of here, I just want to emphasize and show you how incoherent, inconsistent the atheistic worldview is. They can't ground these things that we operate on. They just can't. They can't. And you heard it today. I know all my arguments weren't necessarily stupendous or great or excellent. There are people better than me at arguing, but I still think with my line of questioning, it still revealed the inconsistency of his worldview. And that's the goal, right? I want to show him the inconsistencies of his worldview, so that he will understand that his worldview is absurd. It's absurd. All right? And I pray that God does an amazing work. Would you pray for Matt? Pray for him. If you're out there, pray for Matt and make sure that he comes to Christ. And pray that he comes to Christ. Pray that God does an amazing work in his heart. That God will regenerate his heart and that he will come to Christ. All right? And I'm looking for feedback. Let me know where I erred. Let me know where I can get better. Let me know, what do you guys think? All right? I appreciate you guys. All right, I'm getting out of here. Make sure you hit that subscribe button too. Don't forget that subscribe button. Hit that subscribe. Like, subscribe, notification bell. Hit it right now. Don't leave the channel without hitting it. Thank you for joining me. May God bless you. May God keep you. Go.